Liberia, our second grand political corruption example here. Just as backdrop for Liberia, which was mentioned, I think, in one of the Q&A in the last session, is really right now a darling of the international development community. For those that don't follow Liberia, which many of you probably don't, or should you. But Ellen Johnson Sirleaf on the left, the current president, was a former managing director of the World Bank, a very reform-minded woman, very progressive, who's been president for the last few years. So it was fairly interesting for us as we went out to do fieldwork in Liberia to start to hear some somewhat depressing stories of grand corruption. Benoni Mure, Charles Taylor's business crony and former chief of the Liberia Ship Registry, Taylor is here on the right, of course, an indicted war criminal, is currently under a UN travel ban for alleged economic crimes. Mure personally received about 20% of the ship registry's annual income, according to UN reports on Liberia, and is today one of the most extravagant and flamboyant millionaires in Liberia. While President Sirleaf brags about fighting corruption, this month she appointed Ure as mayor of the elite Americo-Liberian settlement of Carriesburg, one of the cities. Coincidentally, her government refuses to let the public have access to the ship registry budget, even today. Quote, "This confirms long-time suspicions that Ure is an integral part of the president's cronyism in spite of his alleged criminal record under Charles Taylor," says one of the experts from the Foundation of Human Rights and Dignity. So again, a sort of striking example, even in a context where a lot of international development aid, a lot of anti-corruption programs are going on, that again, from a political economy perspective, it becomes very difficult to break these linkages. So even a reform-minded president, like an Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, oftentimes will find it very, very difficult to sort of clean things up with one fell swoop. So these are not just developing country problems. This from Germany is sort of an example of regulatory corruption and how the regulatory process can again be sort of perverted through financial interests. In 2008, the police found more than 10,000 doctored drug use study questionnaires for Emistar, a blood pressure medication that had brought millions of dollars in revenue for drug company Tromsdorf a year before. The most telling finding, the drug use study cover sheets. On them, physicians could choose from what seemed to be a selection of kickbacks after they prescribed Emistar to a certain number of patients. For prescribing the medication to 5 patients, doctors could claim either a 17-inch flat-screen monitor or an iPod. If you prescribed it to 14 patients, you'd be rewarded with a car GPS system or a DVD recorder. 18 patients would bring in a laptop or a PC with a printer. Not into electronic toys, doctors were also offered money as an alternative, which is always the best gift. The, quote, study was in fact a disguised system of illicit payments promoted by the drug company. Several of the questionnaires were filled out by Tromsdorf's own representatives using fictional data, and those studies became known as, quote, fireplace studies, because rather than being filled out in a doctor's office with patients, they were simply being filled out in doctors' homes in front of the fireplace. So I think this sort of example reiterates and drives home that, again, these issues are not just ones that we find in Liberia, that we find in Nicaragua. This is a highly developed, very wealthy, social safety net country in Western Europe, and yet you're seeing massive fraud at a serious scale and significant corruption in the regulatory system. Switching gears, back to a less wealthy place. A lot of the, and just to give some context here, a lot of the current work, I'd argue, in the practitioner community in anti-corruption is trying to look at these sorts of incidents here on service delivery. So how can we reduce corruption and improve service delivery, whether it's in health, education, because that really impacts the poor the most. The poor who can't afford to pay bribes, when they're forced to, it really bankrupts them. So there's a lot of attention around this kind of story coming out of Vietnam. So to quote from our forthcoming notebook, "Corruption can be literally painful, and no one knows this better than patients in Vietnam's hospitals. They make it painful for you," says one woman in her late 40s who works for a caregiver. "But you pay, and the nurses will give you shots without hurting you. Nurses will also tend to jot down anything during the admittance process, your arbitrary heart rate, pulse, blood pressure, and they only correct it if you pay them." Our reporter says that in his first year living in Vietnam, he cut himself badly and went to the hospital. He sat in the ER for an emergency room for over an hour before someone asked him, "Did you give them an envelope?" Now he's learned that in an emergency, you also take envelopes with you to the hospital. You need to hand them with a few bills inside to the intake clerks, the nurses, and the doctors to get any service. People say that with extremely low salaries, corruption is natural. But then you meet people like the judge the writer met a while ago. He travels from village to village, presiding over temporary courtrooms where there normally aren't any. And when he returns to Hanoi, he lives with his wife in a a one-room apartment with a sofa and a double bed. There's a refrigerator and a cupboard in the corner. Their son studies at a small table in an adjacent space. The living situation could be changed if you took bribes. And I think that's sort of striking to remind ourselves that, and this sort of goes back, again back to Jeff's comments, these issues are not always about pure economic self-interest. This judge in Vietnam, who clearly is operating a system where you have to pay a bribe at the hospital not to have a painful shot, could do something else. He could change. If he was a rational economic agent, he would take the bribes, get out of the one-bedroom apartment, but he's chosen not to. So there are, I think, compelling anecdotes out there that suggest, again, this purely economic view of these issues is maybe not the most fulsome one. Staying in the hospital theme and in the basic service delivery context. From Macedonia. With tears in her eyes, 30-year-old Anna S., a fictional name, waited to see her newborn baby, whom she gave birth to in a hospital in a town of 50,000 residents in the southeast part of Macedonia. But before she could see her baby, there was something else she had to do. It had become somewhat of a right in her town that after giving birth, the mother should pay doctors and medical personnel to, quote, deserve their attention. This birth tariff, these days, is around 50 euros for the doctors and 16 euros for each of the other medical assistants. The mothers don't have anywhere to turn and anyone to talk to about this. Nor would they try and denounce this bribery because they're scared to do so in such a small city where everyone knows everybody. Over the years, the behavior has turned into a, quote, tradition in several Macedonian small towns. Why I use this example and share it today is the sort of phenomenon that tends to become entrenched, particularly in small societies, such as, say, Macedonia, and we've seen this elsewhere, particularly in Pacific Islands and other places that are very, very hierarchical and very, very small, that you begin to have these entrenched, concrete behaviors around corruption and bribery. And the challenge, as the sort of victim here is telling our reporter, is that you literally have nowhere to turn. When these societies are so small, when the public service is so small, when the resources are so lacking, there's simply nowhere to go, even if you want to complain. This might be my favorite example from these slides. Again, sticking with sort of basic service delivery, although we're going to talk about airports here. It only takes minutes after landing at Nepal's main airport to have a direct encounter with corruption, as locals, international visitors, and airline workers report widespread bribery and even theft by customs and immigration staff, even by the security personnel posted at the airport. In July of this year, Nepal's anti-graft body, the Commission for the Investigation of Abuse of Authority, which is a great name, come up with the idea of taking a bit of an unconventional approach to corruption. They suggested making pocketless pants mandatory for all airport staff. The measure didn't catch the interest of the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal and didn't do anything except to basically make a mockery about Nepal's corruption situation in the media. And today, bribery and theft continue as usual at the Kathmandu airport. So even when the situation's gotten so bad that we're sort of forced to think about pocketless pants as a way to curb corruption and bribery, again, even that may not work. So there's, again, these are sort of entrenched systems and entrenched incentives that tend to operate regardless of reform-minded officials.